The wind carries a weight it shouldn't. It moves through the modern canopy of spindly oaks and pines with a sound that feels thin, a hollow whistle where there should be a roar. We are told that the forests we see today are the apex of nature's design, the untouched heritage of a wild world. We are told that the giants of the past were exceptions, anomalies of a distant prehistoric era that collapsed under the weight of its own impossibility. But ask yourself why the soil beneath your feet feels like a scab. Look at the plateaus, look at the mesas that rise from the desert floor like severed limbs, their flat tops mimicking the grain of a stump with a precision that defies geological logic. Not a mountain, not a volcano, something else. When you look at the Devil's Tower in Wyoming, the official narrative hands you a story of volcanic plugs and cooling magma. They speak of hexagonal basalt columns formed by cooling phonolite porphyry, a process of contraction that creates a geometry so perfect it feels like a glitch in the natural world. But consider the scale. Consider the cellular structure of a living plant, the way fibre bundles distribute load, the way a tree draws minerals from the deep earth to reach for the heavens. If you scale a redwood to the size of a mountain, you do not get a mountain. You get a biological engine of such immense proportions that it would alter the very chemistry of the atmosphere. The official record is a masterclass in institutional gatekeeping, a systematic erasure designed to make us believe we are living in the prime of history rather than in the ruins of a much larger, much older architecture. We are walking through a graveyard and calling it a garden. The anomalies are small at first, a strange mineral composition in a ridge, a pattern of hexagonal fracturing that persists across continents, but as you look closer, the pattern expands, it becomes a global signature. There is a silence in the archives where there should be a scream. The maps do not match the memories. If you look at the cartography of the 16th and 17th centuries, you see a landmass labelled Tartaria, a vast, sophisticated empire that occupied the heart of Eurasia. Yet it has been scrubbed from the modern curriculum as if it were a mere geographic misunderstanding. They tell us it was just a name for a region, a vague term for the unknown East. But what if the erasure of the name was necessary to cover the erasure of the infrastructure, not just the buildings, not just the star forts, the living infrastructure? Imagine a world where the trees did not merely provide shade, but served as the primary conduits for atmospheric energy. We see the remnants of impossible architecture, the massive stone blocks of Baalbek, the precision of the Great Pyramid, and we struggle to understand how they were moved. We look for cranes and pulleys. We look for the tools of a primitive labourer. We fail to see the energy source because the energy source was biological. The giant trees were not just plants, they were lithospheric antennas. They were the original towers of power, drawing from the ether and the earth to create a grid of resonance that supported a civilization we can no longer comprehend. When you remove the anchors, the ship drifts. When you remove the giants, the sky falls. We see the evidence of a global cataclysm, a mud flood that buried the lower levels of our cities. Yet we are told it was just a series of disconnected urban renewal projects. Ask yourself why every major city on Earth features daylight basements and windows half submerged in the earth. Not architectural style, not drainage necessity, a burial. The removal of the giant trees was the first step in the Grand Reset, a pruning of the world's power, to ensure the new masters could sell us back the light we once pulled from the air for free. There is a specific tension in the way the land is managed today. The national parks are not sanctuaries, they are crime scenes under active surveillance. We are taught to view them as pristine wilderness, yet they are the areas where the stumps are most prevalent, where the scale of the past is most visible. If you examine the load distribution of a mountain like Mount Everest, or the massive formations in Monument Valley, you begin to see the mechanical stress patterns that shouldn't exist in piled rock. You see the signs of petrification, the process by which organic matter is turned to stone over eons. But the timeline we are given is a cage. They tell us it takes millions of years for wood to silicify. Yet we have evidence of rapid petrification occurring in decades under the right chemical conditions. What if the mountains are not millions of years old? What if they are the remains of a harvested forest, petrified by a high-energy event that ended the previous epoch? The institutional erasure is not just about books. It is about the very ground we walk on. They have renamed the stumps to hide the harvest. They call it geology to avoid calling it forestry. This is the ultimate cellulighting of the human race, to stand in the middle of a clear-cut wasteland and believe we are looking at a mountain range. The rhythm of the earth has been changed. The frequency has shifted. When the giant trees fell, the oxygen levels dropped, the pressure changed. Our very biology was stunted, reduced to a fraction of its potential to match the diminished world we were left to inhabit. Not an evolution, not a progression, a managed decline. The documents that remain are fragments, whispers found in the margins of forbidden texts and suppressed journals. They speak of a time when the sky was a different colour, when the pillars of heaven held up a canopy that protected the earth from the harsh radiation of the void. In these accounts, the trees are described as reaching into the ionosphere, acting as bridge points between the terrestrial and the celestial. This is not mythology. This is suppressed physics. The suppression of Tartaria and the removal of the giants are two sides of the same coin. You cannot have a centralized, controlled society if the people have access to an unlimited, decentralized power source. The giants had to go. They were the batteries of a free world. Look at the mining operations of the modern era. We strip mine the earth for coal and lithium, leaving behind scars that look remarkably like the natural formations we are told to admire. If a future civilization looked at a modern open pit mine, would they see an industrial site, or would they see a canyon formed by ancient rivers? The scale of the past dwarfed our current industrial capacity. The craters we call lakes, the ridges we call ranges, these are the tailings piles of an extraction project that spanned the globe. Not a natural landscape, not a geological process, an industrial ruin. The gods of the past were not divine beings. They were the operators of this machinery, and we are the descendants of the workers left behind in the debris. Ask yourself what happens to the ants when the lumberjacks leave. The transition was violent. It wasn't just a slow fading of the old ways. It was a scorched earth campaign. The evidence of extreme heat is everywhere, fused into the very stone of the ancient world. We find vitrified forts in Scotland and melted cities in the Rajasthan desert. The official narrative calls these mysteries and moves on, but the pattern suggests a systematic decommissioning of the old grid. When you want to replace a power system, you don't just turn it off, you destroy the infrastructure so it can never be restarted. The giant trees were not just cut down, they were burned, blasted, and then buried under the redirected silt of artificial floods. This is the origin of the mud flood phenomenon, a global coordinated effort to terraform the earth into a manageable, taxable environment. The new history began with a blank slate, a world of orphans who woke up in a landscape they didn't recognize, surrounded by ruins they couldn't explain. We were told we were the first, the pioneers. the builders of civilization. We were handed a timeline that started in the dirt and moved toward the stars, hiding the fact that we had already been there and were brought back down. The staccato beat of the modern age, the ticking of the clock, the hum of the wire, is a poor replacement for the deep, resonant heartbeat of the living world. Not a beginning, not a dawn, a long, managed sunset. Think about the way we build now. We use steel, concrete, and glass, materials that decay, materials that require constant maintenance. The ancients, the ones who lived among the giants, built with resonance. They used the stone of the stumps themselves, carving cathedrals into the remains of the old world. If you look at the great cathedrals of Europe, you see buildings that are fundamentally over-engineered for their stated purpose. They are not just houses of worship, they are acoustic machines. The pipe organs, the rose windows, the vaulted ceilings, these are components of a frequency-based technology that tapped into the residual energy of the Earth's grid. They are the repurposed ruins of a prior age. The institutional gatekeepers have rebranded these power plants as religious monuments to keep us from asking why they are built on ley lines and why they vibrate at specific hertz. We are told the stained glass is for beauty, but what if it was for filtration? We are told the steeples are for pointing toward God, but what if they were for collecting the ether? The removal of the giant trees forced us into these stone boxes, turning us from participants in a living ecosystem into consumers of a synthetic one. Not a choice, not a gift, a trap. What if the very air we breathe is a diluted version of the atmosphere that once existed, a thin soup designed to keep our brains in a state of perpetual fog? The skepticism of authority is not a choice, it is a necessity for survival in a world built on lies. When you look at the Great Wall of China, do you see a fortification, or do you see a redirected water line? When you look at the pyramids of Giza, do you see tombs, or do you see the cooling fins of a massive subterranean reactor? The scale of the deception is so vast that the mind instinctively rejects it. It is easier to believe in the primitive hunter-gatherer than to believe in the global high-tech empire that was erased. But the evidence is in the geometry. The hexagonal basalt of the Giant's Causeway in Ireland is identical to the microscopic structure of a cornstalk. The mountain of Ben Bulben looks exactly like a shattered trunk. This is not a coincidence. This is the signature of the architect. The erasure trope is used to hide the fact that we are living in a post-apocalyptic world. We are not the peak of humanity. We are the scavengers living in the cracks of a shattered masterpiece. Every time you are told a formation is natural, ask yourself who benefits from that label. Every time you are told a civilization vanished, ask yourself where the bodies went. The institutional erasure of Tartaria was the final blow in a war that lasted centuries, a war against the very memory of what we are and what we are capable of. There is a somber reality to the way we interact with nature today. We take nature walks through forests that are essentially nurseries, thin and frail compared to the elders that once stood. We celebrate the old growth forests, not realizing that these trees are mere sprouts in the eyes of history. The real old growth was miles high. Its canopy didn't just provide shade, it regulated the climate of the entire planet. There were no deserts then. There were no frozen wastes. The giant trees acted as thermal regulators, distributing heat and moisture through their massive root systems and atmospheric transpiration. When they were removed, the planetary thermostat broke. The deserts we see today are the literal dust of the old world, the desiccated remains of a biosphere that was once lush from pole to pole. The ice ages of the official narrative are just cover stories for the climatic collapses that followed the Great Harvest, not a cycle, not a natural rhythm, a catastrophic failure of the cooling system. We are living in the fever dream of a dying planet, and we call the symptoms weather. The inquisitive mind cannot unsee the scars once they are pointed out. The mesas of the American Southwest are not buttes. They are the detritus of a global clear cut. The technical language of geology, terms like orogeny, subduction, and erosion, serves as a linguistic barrier to the truth. It creates a pseudo-academic fog that prevents us from seeing the obvious. When you see a plateau that is perfectly flat and composed of material that is chemically distinct from the surrounding soil, you are looking at a stump. When you see rock layers that are perfectly horizontal and show no signs of the twisting and folding that plateaus should exhibit if they were pushed up from the earth, you are looking at the rings of a tree. The institutional gatekeepers will tell you that the pressure of the earth creates these layers over millions of years, but they cannot explain why there are no erosion marks between the layers. If each layer took 100,000 years to form, where is the evidence of the rain that fell during that time? Where are the riverbeds? Where are the signs of life? The layers are not time, they are structure. They are the vascular tissue of a giant. The staccato rhythm of the excavation continues today under the guise of quarrying. We are still mining the remains of the old world, grinding up the bones of the giants to make the concrete for our prisons, not building, not creating, consuming the past. The final realization is the most unsettling. If the trees were removed to control the power, and if the history was rewritten to hide the theft, then who are we? We are the inheritors of a ghost story. We are a species with amnesia, wandering through a landscape of severed stumps and calling them mountains. The unresolved philosophical loop remains. If we were capable of such greatness, and if we were supported by such a magnificent world, how did we let it fall? What if the giants didn't just die? What if they were killed by something that is still here, watching from the shadows of the institutions it created? The mystery of Tartaria and the giant trees is not just about the past. It is about the present. It is about the limits of our perception and the walls of our cage. Ask yourself, if the trees could reach the sky, what was stopping us from reaching it with them? What if the heavens they reached for were not a vacuum, but a sea of energy we are no longer allowed to touch? The investigative path ends not with an answer, but with a question that echoes through the hollow canyons of the world. Why are we still afraid of the dark? And what is hiding in the light we are no longer allowed to see? Not this world, not that history, something else entirely, something waiting to be remembered. The silence of the modern wilderness is a manufactured product. When you stand in the center of a contemporary forest, the quiet is a symptom of a diminished frequency, a low voltage reality. We are told the pioneers conquered the frontier, but the journals of the earliest explorers tell a different story. A story of finding ruins so vast they were mistaken for the works of gods. They found the star forts, those geometrically perfect bastions of stone and frequency that align with the stars and the subterranean currents of the earth. The official narrative claims these were defensive fortifications built during the age of gunpowder, designed to deflect cannon fire. Ask yourself, why would a military structure require the golden ratio? Why would a fort require intricate water channels and crystalline resonators? Not defense, not war. Something else. These were the substations of the grid, the nodes that connected the biological power of the giant trees to the architectural power of the cities. When the giants were felled, the star forts became useless. their purpose obscured by the new owners who moved in and built their crude brick structures atop the sophisticated foundations of the old world. We call this colonialism. It was actually salvage. The institutional erasure ensures that we see the ruins as new construction, convincing us that our ancestors built what they merely inherited. Look at the architecture of the 1800s. Look at the massive domed structures, the towering columns, and the intricate masonry that appeared in the middle of mud-caked frontier towns. We are told these were built by men with horse-drawn carriages and hand tools, often in a matter of months. Ask yourself how. How does a town of 3,000 people, barely surviving the winter, build a marble state house with a copper dome that would challenge a modern construction firm? The narrative says it was civic pride. The evidence says it was inheritance. These buildings were the terminal points for their atmospheric energy harvested by the giants. The domes were not aesthetic, they were capacitors. The spires were not religious, they were antennas. When the trees were removed, the air lost its charge and the machines grew cold. The new elite, the controllers of the Grand Reset, had to replace the free energy of the ether with the expensive energy of combustion. They buried the bottom floors of the power plants in mud to hide the machinery, creating the Banas daylight basements we see today. They renamed the capacitors churches and the antennas steeples. They turned the technology of transcendence into the theatre of control. There is a technical precision to the erasure that suggests a cold, calculated intent. Removal of the giant trees altered the load distribution of the Earth's crust. This is why we see the rise of earthquakes and volcanic activity in the post-Tartarian era. The trees were the structural staples that held the lithosphere in place, their roots reaching deep into the mantle, anchoring the plates. Without them, the world became unstable. The great floods and mudslides recorded in the 19th century were the geological gasps of a dying system. As the roots decayed, the soil liquefied. Cities sank. Entire regions were swallowed by the earth. This is the origin of the lost civilizations that the official record treats as myth. They didn't vanish into time. They were pulled into the ground by the collapse of the biological grid. The institutional gatekeepers call this natural erosion, but we know it was a structural failure. The skepticism we feel today is the lingering intuition of a species that knows its house was built on the wreckage of a palace, not a progression of history, not an evolution of society, a hostile takeover of a planetary asset. Consider the composition of the mountains again. If you analyze the mineral content of a mesa, you find a high concentration of silicates and carbon, the exact building blocks of life, only petrified. The veins of gold, silver, and copper we mine are the fossilized remains of the tree's circulatory system. We are literally mining the blood of the world. The technical terms used by geologists to describe these deposits, hydrothermal veins, magmatic differentiation, are just sophisticated ways of saying they don't want to admit the Earth was once alive on a scale we cannot imagine. The contrast of scale is the ultimate weapon of the deceiver. By making the truth so large, they make it invisible. A man cannot see the forest if he is standing on the stump of a single tree that covers 3 counties. He sees a mountain range. He sees a valley. He does not see the saw marks of the gods. Ask yourself why the world's most scenic locations are often the most barren. It is because they are the sites of the most intense extraction. The Grand Canyon is not a triumph of water over stone. It is a quarry. It is the footprint of a machine that dwarfed our tallest skyscrapers. The rhythm of the investigative process leads us to the same conclusion. The erasure was not just about the past, but about the potential of the future. By removing the giants, they removed the possibility of a decentralized humanity. In the old world, a man could draw energy from the air simply by standing near a tree or a resonator. He was sovereign, he was connected, he was powerful. In the new world, he must pay for every watt, every drop of water, every breath of filtered air. The transition from the biological grid to the industrial grid was the transition from freedom to domesticity. The institutional erasure of Tartaria was the final movement in this symphony of control. They took our history, they took our energy, and then they took our sense of scale. They made us feel small so we wouldn't notice the size of the chains. The staccato beat of the modern world, the 9 to 5, the credit score, the tax bracket, is designed to keep our eyes on the ground. But the inquisitive mind looks up. It looks at the mesas and sees the stumps. It looks at the cathedrals and sees the power plants. It looks at the maps and sees the missing empire. There is an unsettling tension in the way we are taught to fear the primitive past. We are told our ancestors were dirty, ignorant, and short-lived, yet we cannot replicate their architecture. We are told they were superstitious, yet they understood the geometry of the cosmos with a precision we are only now rediscovering. This is the erasure trope in its purest form, the replacement of a superior reality with an inferior one. The giant trees were the source of our longevity, the high oxygen content, the pressurized atmosphere, the filtered radiation. It was a biological sanctuary. When the trees fell, our lifespans plummeted. We became short-lived because we were removed from the life support system. The Garden of Eden was not a metaphor. It was the world as it functioned before the harvest. The fall of man was the fall of the canopy. Ask yourself why every ancient culture speaks of a world tree that connected the realms. Not a myth, not a symbol, a memory. The skepticism of the investigator is the only lantern in this darkness. We must ask what else has been hidden. If the mountains are stumps and the cities are ruins, then what are the oceans? What if the seabed is just another layer of the quarry, flooded to hide the deepest excavations? The technical language of sea level hides the fact that the water is a recent addition, a liquid veil cast over the evidence of a global crime. The scale of the deception is so total that it requires a complete re-evaluation of our reality, not a slight correction of the timeline, not a minor adjustment of the map, a total revision of what it means to be a human being on this planet. We are not the masters of the earth. We are the tenants of a landlord who has gone to great lengths to hide the deed. The somber realization is that we are living in the leftovers. We are eating the crumbs of a feast we weren't invited to attend. What if the gatekeepers are not just men in suits, but the descendants of those who oversaw the harvest? The institutional continuity of the last 500 years points to a single, unbroken agenda: the creation of the university system, the standardization of history, the monopolization of energy. It all points back to the Great Reset. They are the ones who labelled the stumps as mountains. They are the ones who renamed Tartaria. They are the ones who tell us that our longing for something greater is just nostalgia or imagination. But the soul knows. The soul feels the lack of the giants. It feels the thinness of the air and the coldness of the stone. The inquisitive mind begins to see the patterns in the erasure. It sees the way the truth is hidden in plain sight, disguised as natural beauty or historical necessity. Not a mystery to be solved, a reality to be reclaimed. The technical terms of load distribution and atmospheric resonance are the keys to the lock. When you apply them to the ancient world, the miracles of the past become the engineering of the present. The Great Pyramids were not tombs, they were water pumps. and frequency stabilizers designed to maintain the health of the giants. The massive stone walls of the Andes were not for defense, they were vibrational baffles, protecting the cities from the resonance of the Earth's core. Everything was connected. Everything was part of a single living machine. The removal of the trees was the act of pulling the plug. The world we live in now is the coasting of a motor that has been turned off. We are living on residual momentum, unaware that the power has been cut. Ask yourself, how long can a machine run on nothing? How long before the momentum stops? The unresolved philosophical open loop is this: if the giants were the source of life, and if their removal was the source of our enslavement, then the only way to be free is to grow them again. But we have forgotten how. We have forgotten the seed. We have forgotten the soil. We are looking for political solutions to a biological problem. We are looking for economic answers to a geological theft. The forgotten reason Tartaria's giant trees were removed was to ensure that we would never look up, because if we looked up, we would see how close the sky really is. We would see that we are not trapped on a rock in a void, but that we are part of a living structure that was meant to span the heavens. Not an ending, not a conclusion, a beginning of a different kind of sight. The rhythmic pulse of the investigation leads us into the subterranean. Below the soil of the modern world lies a network of tunnels that the official record attributes to disparate civilizations: the catacombs of Paris, the underground cities of Cappadocia, the thousands of miles of Earth-style tunnels in Europe. They tell us these were hiding places for persecuted Christians or storage for medieval grain. Ask yourself, why would a primitive people excavate thousands of miles of perfectly smooth, vitrified stone using only primitive picks? Why do these tunnels maintain a constant resonant frequency that matches the human heartbeat? Not shelters, not storage, something else. These were the nervous system of the giants. In the old world, the trees did not merely grow upward, they grew inward, their roots forming a biological internet of fibre optic silica that connected every corner of the Tartarian Empire. The institutional gatekeepers have boarded up the entrances, they have flooded the lower levels, they have turned the physical evidence of our global connectivity into spooky tourists, traps or unexplained geological voids. The erasure trope is most effective when it is applied to the very ground we stand on. By cutting us off from the roots, they made us orphans of the surface. Consider the technical term load distribution in the context of the global architectural style known as Tartarian or Antiquitech. Everywhere from San Francisco to Vladivostok, we see the same massive stone structures with iron-wrought details and copper roofs. We are told these were built by different nations with no contact, yet they share a universal blueprint. These buildings were designed to be plugged into the root system. They were the interfaces through which humanity accessed the planetary grid. When the trees were felled, the buildings were lobotomized. Their ornate hardware was stripped away, sold as scrap metal during manufactured wars, and replaced with the dead wires of the combustion age. The staccato rhythm of industrialization was the sound of a species being forced into a treadmill. We are told the 19th century was a time of invention, but a closer look at the patent offices shows it was a time of rediscovery. Men like Tesla were not inventing the future, they were trying to remember the past. They were trying to rebuild the connection to the ether that the removal of the giant trees had severed. The skepticism we hold for the narrative of progress is validated by the sheer quality of the ruins. Modern concrete lasts 80 years before it begins to crumble. The stone of the ancient world, which we now recognize as the petrified wood of the giants, has stood for thousands of years, even after being subjected to the high energy weapons used during the Great Reset. Look at the mountains of the Sahara. They are not sand dunes, they are the ash of a forest that burned for a century. The deserts are the scorched earth remains of the central hubs of the old power grid. The official narrative calls this natural desertification. But ask yourself why the sand is composed of pulverized quartz and minerals that match the cellular structure of high silica vegetation. Not a climate shift, not a lack of rain, a massacre. The giant trees were the anchors of the atmosphere, and when they were destroyed, the sky itself caught fire. This is the fire from heaven, recorded in every religious text. It wasn't a divine judgment, it was a military operation. The institutional gatekeepers have spent centuries building a fence of academic consensus around the truth. They use the contrast of scale to make our questions seem ridiculous. They say, how could a tree be miles high? Yet they accept the existence of mountains that reach those same heights without asking what those mountains are made of. They ignore the fact that rock is often just organized biological matter that has undergone a state change. The pseudo-scientific language of sedimentary layers is used to mask the truth of growth rings. The inquisitive mind must be intellectually provocative. It must look at a canyon and see a scar. It must look at a plateau and see a stump. It must look at the history books and see a redaction. The removal of Tartaria from the maps was necessary because Tartaria was the name of the stewardship. It was the name of the people who protected the giants. To kill the giants, they had to kill the stewards. To hide the crime, they had to erase the name. We are living in a world of stubs. Every small hill, every rolling ridge, every jagged peak, these are the splinters of a broken world. The rhythm of our lives has been downscaled to match the stunted growth of our environment. In the presence of the giants, human consciousness was expansive. We were capable of telepathy, of longevity, of harmony. Without them, we have become fragmented, aggressive, and easily manipulated. The somber tone of our modern existence is the result of this biological grief. We are mourning a loss we are not allowed to name. The institutional erasure has been so successful that we even mock those who suggest that the world was once bigger. We have been trained to be our own jailers, but the pattern is breaking. The mud flood evidence is rising to the surface. The star forts are being mapped. The hexagonal geometry of the mountains is being recognized for what it is. Ask yourself why the elite of our world are so obsessed with space. What if they aren't looking for other planets? What if they are trying to reach the top of the cage? What if they are trying to see if any of the giants are still standing in the forbidden lands beyond the poles? The maps we are given are circular and closed, but the older maps show a world that continues outward, a world of extra terror, not a globe, not a flat disk, a vast, infinite plane of which we are only a small, harvested cell. The removal of the trees was the creation of the ceiling. It was the closing of the door. The skeptical investigator must ask, what is? On the other side of the ice wall, is it more mountains, or is it the living forest that we were taught was a myth? The tension of the current era is the tension of the awakening. The gatekeepers are losing control of the narrative because the scale of the past is becoming impossible to hide. The urban exploration of our own history is revealing that our cities are built on top of something far more sophisticated. The technical terms of our modern science are failing to explain the anomalies. We see the vitrification, we see the melted brick, we see the oversized doorways in old buildings, doorways designed for the giants that lived among us. We are told these were for grandeur, But ask yourself, why waste the energy to heat and build a 30-foot door for a 6-foot man? Not style, not ego, utility. The giants were real, and they were the gardeners of the world. When they were removed, the world became a vacant lot. The rhythm of the erasure is slowing down. The grand reset is being exposed as a recurring cycle, a periodic pruning of human potential to keep us manageable. The removal of the giant trees was the most significant reset in our history, but it wasn't the first, and the gatekeepers intend for it not to be the last. They want to move us into smart cities, which are nothing more than digital cages, where the last remnants of our connection to the earth can be monitored and taxed. They want us to forget the trees entirely, to see the nature of the future as a synthetic, controlled simulation. But the evidence of the giants is too big to be hidden forever. Every mountain is a witness. Every star fort is a beacon. Every daylight basement is a clue. The investigative essayist does not look for a happy ending, but for a true one. The truth is somber. The truth is that we are living in the ruins of a paradise that was intentionally destroyed. But there is power in the remembering. By identifying the Kikis institutional erasure, we strip the gatekeepers of their authority. By recognizing the patent-spaced investigation, we begin to see the world as it truly is. We are not small, we are not weak, we are simply disconnected. The forgotten reason Tartaria's giant trees were removed was to make us believe we are alone in the universe, when in fact we are standing on the shoulders of the very beings that reached for the stars. The unresolved philosophical open loop remains as we look toward the horizon. If the mountains are stumps and we are the ants, then what happens when the forest begins to grow back? There are reports of trees in the deep Amazon, in the remote parts of Siberia, that are growing at a rate that defies modern biology. There are whispers that the frequency of the Earth is rising, that the old grid is being reactivated by the planet itself. The gatekeepers are afraid. They are doubling down on their control, but they cannot stop the sap from rising. The giants are not just a memory, they are a blueprint, and the blueprint is written in our DNA. The institutional gatekeepers have long relied on the concept of deep time to bury the evidence of the harvest. They tell us that the Grand Canyon was carved by a river over millions of years, a slow and patient erosion. But ask yourself, where is the debris? If a river carved a canyon of that magnitude, the delta at its mouth should be a continent unto itself. Instead, we see a clean cut. We see the stepped geometry of a quarry. Not erosion, not time, something else. The technical term is overburden removal. In any large-scale mining operation, you must first strip away the top layers of soil and rock to reach the valuable material beneath. The canyons of the world are the trenches left behind when the gods of the old world harvested the root systems of the giant trees. These roots were not made of wood as we understand it, but of high-grade crystalline structures, precious metals, and rare earth elements that had been concentrated by the biological processes of the tree. The removal of the giant trees was not just a pruning of the sky, it was a pillaging of the earth's interior. We are walking through the empty aisles of a ransacked vault, and they have the audacity to tell us it is natural beauty. Consider the architecture of the World's Fairs at the turn of the 20th century. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893, the St. Louis Exposition of 1904. These were white cities of immense scale, featuring massive domes, intricate statues, and electrical lighting that outshone the modern age. We are told these were temporary structures made of staff, a mixture of plaster and hemp, built in a matter of months, and then burned to the ground when the fairs ended. Ask yourself, why would a civilization build a paradise of stone and light only to destroy it a year later? Not temporary, not plaster, something else. These fairs were the public decommissioning of Tartarian cities. They were the last hurrah of the old grid, a way for the new elite to display the captured technology of the giants before they dismantled it forever. The Stafford narrative is a lie designed to explain why such magnificent buildings no longer exist. They didn't burn them because they were temporary. They burned them because they were evidence. They were the terminal nodes of the etheric grid, and they had to be cleared to make way for the world of wires and meters. The erasure trope is most visible in the way we treat ancient sites like Stonehenge or the pyramids. We are taught to see them as the primitive efforts of a superstitious people. But look at the orientation, look at the precision. These sites are located at the exact pressure points of the Earth's telluric currents. They are the acupuncture needles of the planet. When the giant trees were removed, the Earth's energy became chaotic, leading to the great reset of the weather systems and the magnetic poles. The stone circles and pyramids were built by the survivors of the Tartarian era, the remnant, in a desperate attempt to stabilize the frequency of the world. They were trying to hold the atmosphere together without the help of the giants. The institutional gatekeepers have rebranded these machines as tombs and temples to disconnect us from their functional reality. By making the past mystical, they make it irrelevant to the modern engineer. But the engineering is precisely what we need to understand. Look at the load distribution in the massive stone blocks of Puma Punku or Tiwanaku. These are not just stones, they are geopolymer, liquid stone that was poured and moulded using a technology we are only now beginning to replicate. The ancients didn't haul stones, they grew them. They understood the chemistry of the earth because they lived in a world where the distinction between organic and inorganic was blurred. The giant trees were the bridge. They turned the minerals of the earth into the fibers of the sky. When they were removed, the bridge was broken. We were left on the mineral side of the gap, forced to use heat and fire to manipulate the world, rather than resonance and growth. The staccato rhythm of the hammer replaced the steady hum of the vine. We became materialists, not because we discovered the truth of matter, but because we lost the truth of spirit. The skepticism of authority must extend to the very map of the stars. We are told we are on a speck of dust in an infinite vacuum, but the star forts suggest a different geometry. They are aligned with a celestial canopy that behaves more like a resonant chamber than a void. What if the passage they are trying to reach is actually the upper layers of the old world's atmosphere, the firmament that was once supported by the giants? What if the satellites are actually tethered to the remains of the old canopy, floating in the dense, energetic ether that the controllers have renamed dark matter? Language of modern physics is a masterpiece of institutional gatekeeping, a mathematical fence designed to keep our minds from wandering to the forbidden territories of the ether. They give us gravity to explain why we are stuck, but they hide the levity that the giants used to reach the sun. The somber reality is that we are being managed like livestock in a field that used to be a palace. The wars of the 19th and 20th centuries were not about ideology or territory. They were about the destruction of the old infrastructure. Every bombing raid was a targeted strike against a Tartarian power station or a historical archive. The Great Fire of London, the Great Fire of Chicago, the Great Fire of San Francisco, these were not accidents. They were the intentional burning of the evidence. The reset requires the destruction of the memory, and fire is the most efficient eraser. They replace the grand, resonant stone of the past with the thin, brittle wood of the nursery. Forests, ensuring that our homes would be as temporary as our lives, not a civilization, a camp. What if the giant legends of every culture are not myths, but eyewitness accounts of the beings who lived among the trees? If a tree is 5 miles high, a man who stands 20 feet tall is not a giant, he is a gardener. The Nephilim, the Titans, the Anunnaki, these were the biological peers of the old world. When the trees were removed, the giants could no longer survive. The pressure dropped, the oxygen thinned, and their massive hearts could no longer pump the blood through their frames. They died alongside their forests, their bodies petrifying into the rock formations we are told to admire. Look at the sleeping giant in Ontario. Look at the old man of the mountain. These are not pareidolia, the tendency to see faces in random patterns. These are the literal remains of the ancestors, turned to stone by the same high-energy event that petrified the stumps. We are walking on the bodies of our fathers, and we call it hiking. The rhythm of the investigation brings us to the institutional erasure of the Tartarian language. They tell us that Latin is the mother tongue, but Latin is a constructed language, a simplified code designed for law and administration. The true language of the old world was a tonal, resonant tongue that could manipulate matter through sound. This is the origin of spells and incantations. It wasn't magic, it was acoustic engineering. When the giants were removed, the Tower of Babel event occurred as a systematic fracturing of human language to ensure we could no longer coordinate our efforts to rebuild the grid. They gave us words to keep us from speaking. They gave us grammar to keep us from resonance. We are shouting into a wind that no longer carries our voice. The inquisitive mind must ask, who is the architect? Who ordered the harvest? If the history of the last 500 years is a lie, then the identity of our rulers is the greatest lie of all. They are not leaders, they are liquidators. They are the ones who were given the contract to manage the ruins. They maintain the illusion of progress to keep us from noticing the decay. They give us technology that is actually a downgrade. A smartphone is a poor replacement for telepathy. An airplane is a primitive substitute for the etheric flight of the old world. The contrast of scale between what we have and what we lost is the measure of our enslavement. The unresolved philosophical open loop is the question of the seed. If the giants were removed, where are the seeds? Are they hidden in the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, protected not from a future catastrophe, but from the present humanity? What would happen if a single seed of the world tree were planted in the right soil, with the right frequency? Would the giants return? Would the pressure rise? Would our memories come flooding back? The controllers are terrified of this possibility. They spend billions on environmental protection, not to save the planet, but to ensure that the wrong kind of life doesn't sprout. They want a green world, but only the kind of green they can tax. The forgotten reason. Tartaria's giant trees were removed was to make sure the earth would never again belong to the earth. It belongs to the stockholders now, but the earth is patient. The earth remembers, and deep in the forbidden zones, the roots are beginning to stir. The institutional gatekeepers have constructed a fortress of geological periods to ensure the mind never connects the dots between the canyon floor and the forest floor. They tell us the Precambrian, the Paleozoic, and the Mesozoic are chapters in a story of mindless chemical chance. But look at the mesas of the Hopi land. Look at the islands in the sky of the canyon lands. These are not the products of slow uplift. They are the remaining fibers of a world that was biological before it was mineral. The technical term stratification is the academic mask for growth rings. When you look at the walls of the Grand Canyon, you see horizontal layers of sediment that the narrative says took billions of years to accumulate. Yet, the contact points between these layers, the paraconformities, are as smooth as a knife edge. There is no soil between them. There are no worm burrows. There are no root systems of smaller plants. This is impossible under the official timeline. If the surface was exposed for millions of years before the next layer arrived, the wind and rain would have scarred it beyond recognition. The layers are smooth because they were formed simultaneously. They are the vascular rings of a singular massive organism. We are living in a splinter of a tree that was once the size of a continent. Consider the load distribution of the world's most ancient mountain ranges. Geologists struggle to explain why the Appalachian Mountains or the Urals show signs of extreme weathering, while the Himalayas are young and jagged. Ask yourself, what if it isn't age? What if it is the method of harvest, not erosion, not time? Something else. The smoother ranges are the sites where the giants were cut with precision, the stumps left to petrify in the open air. The jagged ranges are the sites of the great breakage, where the giants were shattered by high-energy weaponry during the final stand of the Tartarian resistance. The Himalayas are not young. They are a debris field. They are the splinters of the world columns that held up the sky. The institutional erasure of this fact is necessary to hide the scale of the violence that was used to subdue the earth. They call it plate tectonics, to make the destruction of our world feel like a natural, inevitable process of a restless planet. But the planet wasn't restless. It was being dismantled. Look at the technical terms used to describe the formation of coal. We are told it is fossilized swamp matter that was buried and pressurized over millions of years. But the coal seams we find are often hundreds of feet thick and stretch for thousands of miles. To create a coal seam that size, you would need a swamp the size of the Pacific Ocean, filled with a density of life that no modern ecosystem could support. And yet, we find polystrate fossils, fossilized trees standing upright, passing through multiple layers of coal and rock. According to the official timeline, the bottom of the tree stood for millions of years without rotting, while the top layers were slowly deposited. Not time, not pressure, something else. The coal seams are the pulverized, carbonized remains of the giant canopy. When the trees were felled, the massive volume of organic material was subjected to an atmospheric flash cooking event, a surge of electromagnetic energy that turned the biological wealth of the planet into the fuel for the new industrial masters. They are selling us the remains of our own heritage to power the machines of our enslavement. The skepticism of the investigator must turn toward the Great Reset of the mid-19th century. This was the era of the orphan trains, the era when thousands of children were shipped across the world to repopulate cities they didn't build. Ask yourself, where did the parents go? Why are the censuses of the 1850s and 60s so riddled with inconsistencies? The civil wars and revolutions of that period were the clean-up operations. They were the final sweeps to remove the last generation that remembered the giants. They gathered the children, put them in the basements of the Tartarian ruins and told them a new story. They gave them a new language. They gave them a new history where the giants were myths and the stumps were mountains. The staccato rhythm of the Industrial Revolution was the sound of these orphans being put to work, grinding up the ruins to build the brick and mortar reality we inhabit today. We are the grandchildren of those orphans, still repeating the lies we was told in the nursery. The sombre reality is that the atmosphere we breathe is a corpse. The giant trees were the lungs of the world, and their transpiration created a water canopy that acted as a pressurized hyperbaric chamber. In that environment, wounds healed instantly. Aging was a slow, graceful process that took centuries. The giants of legend were simply humans who lived in the presence of the giants of the forest. When the trees were removed, the pressure dropped. The heavens receded. The radiation from the sun, once filtered through miles of bioluminescent leaves, became a scorching, carcinogenic force. We are living in a low-pressure system, a biological vacuum that has shrunk our bodies and clouded our minds. The institutional gatekeepers call this evolutionary adaptation. We should call it starvation. We are gasping for a breath that the modern world can no longer provide. The rhythm of an investigation leads us to the star forts once more. These structures are often found in the most remote corners of the earth, on tiny islands, in the middle of deserts, atop the highest peaks. The official narrative says they were outposts, but look at the load distribution of the energy they managed. They are built on magnetic null points, places where the Earth's field is most susceptible to manipulation. They were the pressure valves of the old world. When the giants were removed, the energy of the Earth became unstable, and the star forts were used to bleed off the excess charge to prevent the planet from literal fragmentation. The wars fought over these forts were not about territory. They were about who would control the bleeding of the world. The victors became the elites, the ones who hold the keys to the pressure valves and decide how much reality we are allowed to experience. What if the erasure trope is applied to the very stars themselves? The ancients spoke of fixed stars and a wandering firmament. Modern astronomy tells us we are moving through a void at millions of miles per hour. But ask yourself, why do the constellations remain unchanged after thousands of years? If we are hurtling through an infinite vacuum, the sky should be a chaotic blur of shifting lights, not a void, not a journey, something else. The stars are the reflections of the old grid in the upper layers of the atmosphere, the residual glow of the etheric connection that once existed between the giant trees and the celestial canopy. They are the ghost lights of a dead forest. The institutional gatekeepers give us light years and galaxies to make the stars feel distant and unreachable. They want us to believe the sky is empty, so we won't notice that it is a ceiling. The inquisitive mind must be intellectually provocative enough to ask, what is the forbidden reason in its totality? It is not just about power. It is not just about gold. It is about the unresolved philosophical open loop of human potential. As long as the giants stood, we knew we were divine. We saw the bridge to the heavens every time we looked up. The trees were the living proof that the earth and the sky were one. By removing them, the controllers didn't just take our energy, they took our identity. They made us believe we are accidents of chemistry rather than architects of frequency. The removal of the giant trees was an act of deicide, the killing of the God impulse within the human soul. They turned the world into a material place so they could become the masters of the material. The tension of the current investigation is reaching a breaking point. We are seeing the melted buildings of the old world being rebranded as natural rock formations in our national parks. We are seeing the vitrified stone of the ancient forts being ignored by archaeologists who cannot explain how it was fused without modern lasers. The technical terms are failing. The institutional erasure is cracking. People are beginning to look at the Devil's Tower and see the fibre bundles. They are looking at the Giant's Causeway and seeing the cellular geometry. They are looking at the Grand Canyon and seeing the saw marks. Not a mountain, not a canyon, a stump, a quarry, a crime scene. The final realization is that the investigation never ends because the truth is a living thing. It is the sap that still flows in the hidden roots. It is the frequency that still hums in the star forts. It is the memory that still flickers in our dreams. The forgotten reason. Tartaria's giant trees were removed was to make us forget that we are the gardeners, but the garden is still here, buried under the mud and the lies, and the next step is not to find more evidence, but to begin the regrowth. The inquisitive, skeptical mind is the first sprout. The intellectually provocative question is the first drop of rain. We are the seed of the new world, and we are waking up in the ruins of the old.